All right, welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky. I am your host for today's program. Now, on Standing for Truth, we defend the truth of biblical creation. And I am thrilled to have Helmut Welke back with me today for an important program. Helmut will be speaking on the fossil record. He will be reviewing many of the famous so-called transitional fossils that proponents of evolution look to as evidence for common descent. This isn't Helmut's first time here. His presentations have been a blessing to this ministry. And so please see the description box of this video or the official website, standingfortruthministries.com, for links to his previous presentations on this channel. You'll find presentations such as aliens, UFOs, and the Bible, and also a presentation that focuses on our ancestors, Adam and Eve. Helmut, as always, I understand how busy you are, and so I really appreciate the time that you offer us. How you doing today?
Good, Donnie. Glad to be here again. Always enjoy chatting with you.
Amen. I love it. I'm looking forward to this, Helmut. And so before we get into your presentation that I am excited to see, it's definitely a popular topic, the fossil record and the so-called transitional fossils. And so I'm going to give our guest here, Helmut, a formal introduction before we get into the presentation. Mr. Welke is a retired engineering manager, having worked in a variety of U.S. and international assignments with a Fortune 100 company. In 2006, he was elected to the board of trustees of an international society serving the industrial and systems engineering profession. He holds a U.S. patent and is well versed in the use of science to design and manufacture advanced products. His bachelor's and master's degrees in industrial engineering were awarded by the University of Illinois at Urbana. In 2012, he was elected a fellow of the Institute of Industrial Engineers. Helmut is a member of the Creation Research Society and an ambassador for Logos Research Associates. He recently was elected president of Creation Summit, an organization that seeks to bring the truth of creation to college campuses through seminars and organized debates. He has presented creation science in schools, churches, and at civic organizations throughout the United States, plus France, Poland, and Germany. Helmut has been looking at the creation evolution question for over 30 years and wants young people everywhere to hear both sides of the issues. Amen. In other words, Helmut, you're more than qualified and equipped to be speaking on these topics, brother. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, thank you. I think there's a lot of good things to discuss. Some of it everybody can find, but I hope I put it together in a nice package for you today. I was just tinkering with it, so I hope the presentation is not too disjointed, but we'll get through it. Should we go ahead and jump to it?
Absolutely. Sounds good, Helmut. I can get your screen up here for people to see. And there we go. Looks good. I can see your first slide.
Okay, you can see the whole little thingamajiggy there and Tiktaalik and other fossils. And some of you may remember I've moved to Tennessee in the last 7 months or so. And we're in the process of forming a Tennessee Creation Fellowship. We just got our website up. I did a presentation on dinosaurs last night. But anyway, let's get into this. Fossils. An interesting quote that came from Scientific American is, okay, let's fix this. There we go. That fossils are set in stone, but their interpretation is not. And that's the key. What are we going to interpret? What really makes sense in various people's interpretation of what the fossils actually say. So let's review. Let's go back to Darwin's book. And in his own book, he writes this: the number of intermediate varieties which must have formerly existed on the earth must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? That is the key right there. He says This perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Well, today we have a lot of other new sciences such as microbiology and genetics, but those are other talks that are great objections to his theory. But it's quite clear Darwin believed his own story, and he never recanted. He continued to bask in the acclaim that he got because people, that society in general, just didn't want to live under the rules of the Bible, particularly in those days, which were probably a little extreme, but still was blamed on the Bible, and he wanted nothing to do with the Bible. He had a lot of other things going on in his life. But in his book, he does admit here that every geological formation should be full of intermediate links. We're not just talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe half a dozen to a dozen examples, all of which today are very controversial. There should be hundreds of thousands of examples of intermediate forms if his theory was true. But he just went on to predict that as we dug into the fossil record, we would find the proof of his theory. And what should we find? If random evolution was true, if the evolution of life from a simple cell to an invertebrate to a vertebrate, and finally mankind, if that really happened according to Darwin's one tree of life, then we should find lots of intermediate forms throughout the fossil record, not just a few controversial finds, which we will get into. But this is what should be, this is what Darwin said himself we should find in the years after his book was published. It's now been 165 years. And so there should be a continuum of fossils randomly scattered throughout the earth, randomly showing all sorts of transitional life forms. And of course, you could also ask, why aren't there more transitions alive today if they really existed? And this evolution is an ongoing, slowly moving process. There should be lots of intermediates, dead and alive, if you really think about it. Now, the alternative, of course, is special creation. That, as it says in Genesis, God created the biblical kinds. And if special creation was true, then we expect to find only fully formed forms of life similar to the variety today, with clear divisions between the classes and phyla as we observe today. And I would submit that maybe this is at the family level of classification. You have species, you have genus, and then you have family. So one example of this would be the cat kind. Now notice the creation orchard is the basic biblical kinds as created in the Bible in Genesis for both plants and animals, but we'll look at just mostly the animals today. And there is an orchard. Instead of Darwin's one single tree, the creation orchard concept would say there are many trees in God's orchard, each the original created kind. Is there variation today among the original created? Yes, but they are within strict limits, clear divisions as we see today. For example, I talked about the cat kind. We could have a pair of originally created cat kinds, and we do have some fossils and artistic renditions of what an early cat might have looked like. You would only need two of these in creation and then coming off the Ark of Noah. And they, over the centuries, and it happens fast, we know today, you can get within the one cat kind tree, God's orchard, you get variation of different animals, but they're all cats. For example, the cat kind's descendants that went south, some of them became lions and cheetahs. Others that went east became tigers. And then, of course, we know the Egyptians domesticated cats to what we have today as a common house cat. But if you ever watch a tiger or a lion in a zoo, they behave like cats, with licking their paws and looking around and strutting about like they have no cares in the world. But they're cats, and you're never going to get, no matter how much we breed cats for big and small, short hair, very little hair, long hair, cats that can run wild, they're still a cat kind. So I'd say one of the trees in God's orchard is the cat kind, which is basically the family level of felines. And then we should have all these other different trees. You can have the eagle kind. Today we have bald eagles, African eagles, brown eagles, and a few others. Perhaps vultures might be in that family. That's something that's being researched even today by the Creation Research Society. What is the biblical kind? But you have multiple trees. And do we have evidence of multiple trees in God's creation orchard? Or does it look like everything came from one single cell in a single tree of life, as Darwin predicted and taught? And people have been teaching that idea ever since. So Darwin knew there was an absence of transitional forms. That's why he asked that question. Why aren't they everywhere? Now let's jump 85 years later, 1944, at least that's when this was published. A world-class evolutionary paleontologist, Dr. Simpson, said, this regular absence of transitional forms is not confined to mammals, but is an almost universal phenomenon, as long as been noted by paleontologists. It's true of almost all orders, of all classes of animals, both vertebrate and invertebrate. Alphatori, it's also true of the classes and of the major animal phyla, and it's apparently true of many categories of plants. So 85 years later, not much. No, we're missing those transitions. Now let's go to 100 years, 9 years after Darwin's book, 1968. Dr. West from Kansas State University wrote, contrary to what most scientists write, the fossil record does not support Darwinian theory of evolution because it is this theory, and there are several, which we use to interpret the fossil record. By doing so, we are guilty of circular reasoning if we then say the fossil record supports this theory. So you may have a few bones. You say it's a transitional form. Oh, it proves that this thing evolved into that. It's true. But that's because you're already assuming evolution is true, and you're just trying to fill in some gaps. And often there's a lot more imagination than there is in the fragments of the bones. And I'll give you some examples of that later on. Okay, now we're up to 118 years. Stephen Gould, professor, paleontologist from Harvard, very famous evolutionist, he wrote in 1977 that the fossil record with its abrupt transition offers no support for gradual change. In other words, Darwin's idea. But all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. Maybe they're like the different trees in that orchard we talked about. We'll come back to this quote, but it's going to be worth repeating. Because Dr. Gould admitted, and he seemed to be one of the most honest scientists, even though he had a strong belief in evolution. He said the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data on the tips and nodes to rest as inference, however reasonable, but not the evidence of fossils. So it's an interpretation that you're trying to fill in these gaps, and people really do that. Okay, let's jump about 123 years later. We have a book where it was written by a couple of professors. 120 years of paleontological research later, it has become abundantly clear that the fossil record will not confirm this part of Darwin's predictions. They're being generous, they're trying to be kind, but by the 1980s, we still don't really have proof of Darwin's theory. We go to 1998 in the major encyclopedia. Dr. Fisher wrote, one of the most difficult problems in evolutionary paleontology has been the almost abrupt appearance of the major animal groups. Oh my goodness, we're up to almost the year 2000 and we still have abrupt appearance of major animal groups, which fits the creation model and not Darwin's single tree of life. Let's keep digging. Now we're up to into the year 2000. Ernst Mayr, who was a very staunch evolutionist, he was even called Darwin of the 20th century, he wrote, Given the fact of evolution, one would expect the fossils to document a gradual, steady change from ancestral forms to the descendants. But this is not what the paleontologist finds. Instead, he or she finds gaps in just about every phyletic series. Come on now, we should have this proof by now that Darwin predicted we would have. But even evolutionists are admitting, we got these big gaps still. This evolutionary tree of Darwin is still not being very evident in the fossil record. How many of you heard of the Cambrian explosion? This is going to be one of the examples of the problems with the fossil record. At the very bottom of the sedimentary rocks, there's a series of layers or of sediments that are called part of the Cambrian. There's a sub-series within the Cambrian, but it's called the Cambrian explosion because what we have is an explosion of life. The Cambrian explosion is not just a case of all the major animal phyla appearing in about the same place in the geological column. It's also a situation of no ancestors to suggest how they might have evolved. So what happens in the Cambrian explosion? We've got all types of complex creatures. These happen to be sea creatures that live at the bottom of seas, shallow seas, but they are very representative of the major animal phyla that we have today. And they just appear in this series of sedimentary rocks. These sedimentary rocks are the first ones sitting on the igneous and what we would call the original rocks of creation, as if they were part of a flood event. And the first things to be buried are things that lived in the ocean near the edge of the continents. But you've got a whole lot of things. You've got your trilobites over there on the right-hand side of the screens. These are not just simple forms of life, which people thought maybe that's all they were 100 years ago, nothing with a backbone, they were just simple. But now we know these are complex creatures. And how do they even build shells? There's a whole mystery about that and the artisticness about them. Very creative colorings and things. But what's really interesting are the eyes. These eyes are very complex. Trilobites is just one of the most complex, but they're all already there. They're already functioning. And that's why they say it's an explosion of life, because in the rocks below this, you have no fossils other than a few bacteria, single cell creatures. But to go from a single cell to these complex creatures, things like squids, nautiloids, which are now extinct, the trilobites, all kinds of marine plants, where do they come from? They just pop into those rocks as if a whole habitat of things under the sea was suddenly buried and have no ancestors. That's why it's called an explosion of life. Okay. Well, if you look at it, even evolutionists have to admit there's no question that such gaps exist. A big gap appears at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion over 500 million years ago, when great numbers of new species suddenly appeared in the fossil record. That's why they call it the Cambrian explosion. That's the name of the rocks, and it's just an explosion of life. So where'd they get the 500 million years? That's just a guess. Well, it must have taken 500 million years for a simple cell to have evolved into a trilobite or a nautiloid or all the other plants and animals that live under the sea. They're not that simple. And so, you got 500 million years here of Earth history that's missing. And people know it. In fact, I recently heard of a paleontologist and another evolutionary atheist who wanted to explain this a little bit better. He's proposed that we should change the name of the Cambrian explosion because it sounds like a sudden appearance of things being created that lived in this habitat and not evolution. So he wanted to call it something mild, like the Cambrian events, or something milder than an explosion. But I don't think his idea is caught on because it does look like an explosion. But of course, We do have all these different types of life forms, as you can see in the white area of this graphic. And then they draw in lines, and they try to talk about how the eukaryotes came from prokaryotes, and then in the very simple cells. And then you have the Cambrian explosion in the white of all those different types of life forms. And then they try to show how they evolve. Now remember, they're admitting you have 500 million years of supposed time in history. Drawing lines on what they evolved from is nothing. Anybody can pull out a crayon and it'd be just as scientific. This does not prove evolution, but this is what college students in their first years of studying evolutionary biology are taught, because we are interpreting what we see according to a theory that we already believe. And that is not how science works. Here is the actual picture of the Great Unconformity. The Great Unconformity is easily seen in the Grand Canyon. It's also been identified in Wisconsin and in Europe and Israel. What it is, it's the actual border of the granite type of rocks, the creation rocks, your igneous rocks. And then look at the horizontal sweep of the sedimentary rocks just above Mr. Vale's hand there. You can see how it looks like maybe this was the beginning of the flood sediments with all that mud at the bottom of tsunamis, which we see still today happening, but it just comes and planes the original, what we would call creation rocks, just planes it smooth. And there are places where you can see that these granites underneath are coming at an angle, but then right away, it's smooth. So you could put your hand on the Great Unconformity, and that's the actual name for it, because it doesn't conform to the story. We have 500 million years of missing evolutionary stories and history between the first sedimentary rocks, the beginning of the Cambrian sediments, and the creation rock underneath. It looks more like it was one big event, like maybe a flood event, a catastrophic event, killing all the things living at the bottom of the seas at the first stage. But that's what it is. It's the Cambrian explosion. And so you get all these complex types of fully formed invertebrates, many of which are very similar to today. Everything from sea lilies to various other types of plants and small animals. Some are extinct, like nautiloids and trilobites, but we have others like sponges that we still have today. Invertebrate. But then there's another inconsistency. You got to go from an invertebrate fossil to a vertebrate, something with a backbone. A backbone is pretty significant. It's going through the animal, like if you've ever cleaned a fish on a fishing trip and you've actually done it. Well, some of these fish that are in the fossils look like some of the sunfish and other panfish that I catch today. And they've got this backbone, and it's pretty nice when all the correct organs are inside the rib cage and everything else functions, and all of the things that internally have to be there, not just the bone structure, but the nerves, blood vessels, all kinds of things, tendons, connectors. They've all got to be in the correct place as if they were designed to be there. So think about that. To go from an invertebrate, no backbone, to something with a backbone, wow. How does an exoskeleton, if they even have one, migrate to the inside of the creature? There has to be all kinds of interaction with the lungs, the guts, the heart, muscle attachments, not to mention the nerves and everything else, because it wouldn't be good if a rib went through the heart because of, it was on its way to evolving that like that. That wouldn't last very long, now would it? So even this step is another unconformity. The transformation from invertebrates to vertebrates would have been a major event in Earth's evolutionary history if it happened. And supposedly, they just say, this must have taken 100 million years. Yet the fossil record does not leave a single shred of evidence for this enormous transformation. Come on now. As Darwin said, we should have all kinds of intermediate forms, because this is a big deal. It's one thing to go from a simple cell to all those multicellular creatures like nautiloids and trilobites and sponges. And now you're going to go from those invertebrates to a vertebrate creature? They just say, well, it probably took 100 million years based on no evidence. Well, this lack of intermediate fossils, especially between invertebrates and vertebrates, is well documented in the scientific literature. Carl Zimmerman, Science magazine, not that long ago, wrote, the fossil record provides few clues to help resolve this contradiction because there are no animal fossils that old and no examples of an intermediate species. No examples. This is a huge missing link in Darwin's story and the single tree of life. So, after 150 years, how many fossils do we have? Well, too many to count. We probably have 1 billion fossils. People are finding them, and 99% of the time, they're simply the same thing what we've already found and been cataloged. In all the museums, universities, and collections around the world, we've got probably 250 million cataloged fossils. It ought to be enough to see the big picture if Darwin's story was right. But we don't have it. The fossil record does not show evolution, which is Darwin's speculation on the right of the screen. But what we find is all kinds of creatures appearing. Some continue to appear till today, and some do go extinct, or they appear and disappear. But there's a lot of reasons for that in the fossil record. But so far, the fossil evidence fits the left screen because that's what it is, and evolution does not appear to be there. Here's another story on the evolution of mammals. Look at all the mammals across the top. The dark blue, the solid blue lines are actual examples of fossils, including horse fossils. And then we've got a few other things that are found here and there, and they did go extinct. But notice it's the connecting lines, the dotted lines. That's how they want to present the story of evolution of mammals from some small mouse-like creature that lived at the time of dinosaurs. But let's take away the evidence. It's just not there. So you're inferring what you already want to believe on a record that does not conform to it. Do you see the problem? And then a botanist at the University of Nebraska recently wrote, the mystery of the origin of flowering plants was and still is complicated by the lack of any obvious candidates for the next of kin for the group. It's a big point. Did you ever wonder about plant evolution? Where did rose bushes and pine trees and grass fields and fields of corn and wheat, where did that evolve from? That's all part of Darwin's single tree, isn't it? Plant evolution is rarely talked about because they don't even have a good story when it comes to this part of the evolutionary tree and made up story, really. I want to see some science. I want to see some evidence. Now, this point of plant evolution is interesting. Remember that. You can use it to ask evolutionists, I might asking you questions about what about this, what about this? Okay, now you can ask a few questions. In fact, when I was in Europe several years ago, and somebody published an article that had a lot of my quotes and information, and it was a basically Christian magazine published in German out of Switzerland. And after that got published, a scientist from the University of Zurich wrote to the publisher and said, how can anybody believe in creation? In this age of science, we are beyond this. And he was kind. It was a nice letter, nicely worded, but he basically was attacking everything that I had said in the article and the whole idea of creation. In other words, so many professors like to do that. Yeah, creation's gone. Can't trust the Bible. We got evolution. We got Darwin's book. Well, I did a little research, contacted him. They gave me his email. And then we exchanged a whole series of email. They were pretty nice. We were civil. And I had some discussions. He asked me some questions. I answered them. And I said, now, wait a minute. I got to ask you some questions. One of the questions I asked him was, what about the evolution of all the oak trees? Germany was famous for the great forests of oak trees, and they do make beautiful oak furniture. in Central Europe. I found out this professor was actually an expert on plants and particularly trees. He even was involved in some UN studies on forests around the world, and he was brought in by the UN as a consultant because he's an expert on trees and they wanted to help the forests, which I think is fine. It's one of the things we should use our knowledge for. But I did ask him, okay, you're an expert on trees. What did oak trees evolve from? Think about their massive trunk of a beautiful hardwood. The tree bark is unique to oak trees. There's red oaks, there's white oaks, and there's other oaks, but they're all oak trees. They all have acorns and the unique shape of an oak leaf. Where did they evolve from? Well, he wrote back and said, oh, there's a lot of evidence of the evolution of oak trees. And he sent me 2 links to 2 different scientific papers. Well, I actually looked at them, read them, and I wrote back to him, now, wait a minute. All these papers they assume evolution is true, but the evidence they're presenting is only that we are finding evidence of oak trees deeper and deeper in the fossil record. So they have evidence and they have nice pictures of a fossilized oak tree leaf and acorns, obviously oak trees, but they're finding them deeper in the record, but they're still oak trees. And so I pointed that out to him. You know, I read your papers, these ideas. There's nothing about evolution of the oak trees, what they evolved from. Well, he tried to muddle the words a little bit, and I said, no, I drove back home. What did oak trees evolve from? Give me the transitional form. You're an expert. Finally, he wrote back and said, well, we think oak trees evolved from green algae. Really? We have green algae today, and we have living oak trees. We have them both today. The fossil record, we have green algae, and we have oak trees. Good signs of oak trees, branches, leaves, acorns. But there's nothing in between. Where did they evolve from? Well, he gave up and said, we'll just have to agree to disagree. Well, I'm sorry, I want evidence. If you're going to tell people that my ideas are wrong and you got it right, then give me some evidence. What did oak trees evolve from? And here's an admission that flowering plants and plants in general have no evidence of evolving from some simple cell. So what did they say? Well, here's an example. Dr. William Provine used to be at Cornell. He said, the evidence for the big transformations in evolution are not there in the fossil record. It's difficult to explore a billion-year-old fossil record. Be patient. Oh, come on. Okay, I can be patient. You want to wait another 100 years? Well, you're not going to be around. Dr. Provine has already passed away. But if you want to teach this as truth, let's have some evidence. Otherwise, you can't even call it a theory of evolution. There's so many problems with it. It's a proposal, and maybe it's a model that you choose to believe in, but it's not science because the evidence is not there. You can be patient, say someday we'll find it like Darwin did 165 years ago, but that's a statement of faith, not science. Well, what about fish tetrapods, things that go on 4 legs? Well, in 1988, it was admitted we have not found any fossils that are intermediate between such clearly terrestrial animals and the strictly aquatic Rhabditistians, can't say it, I'm sorry, described in the previous chapter. In other words, to go from an amphibian to a tetrapod, a land animal on 4 stout legs. Oh, 2006, it was announced we have Tiktaalik, the fossil, the perfect missing link between fishes of the sea and amphibians and land creatures. And students are shown this, which is mostly imagination, to say it's really science. It's a creature emerging out of the woods, crawling on very enlarged front fins, and are giving the impression that Tiktaalik is a virtual snapshot of a fish becoming a land animal. How can that really happen? And why would it happen? If a fish is so nicely adapted to the sea, why would it even want to go on land? Well, there are some animals that do have some features, but nobody calls them transitional forms. But today we have what's called lobe-finned fishes. And they think these lobes, which are the front fins, do have some bones. They think that's evolving into legs. And because of these, some scientists were teaching that the first amphibians were descendants of lobe-finned fishes. And that's simply because there are some bones in those fins, but they're not connected to the backbone. They are just stiffeners in those fins. And so as they look at the evolution from fish to amphibians, these are some of the different animals that have been suggested are fossils. You can see over time, these have all been reclassified as either truly amphibians, nothing in between, or truly fish, including coelacanths down there in the lower right. That was supposedly a fish that went extinct over 360 million years ago, and it was on its way to becoming an amphibian. Only problem is we then found it. I guess extinct for 70 million years. But anyway, there is a lobe-finned fish. Living ones are found. It just shows, for one thing, it's a living fossil. Just because something disappears in the fossil record, like a coelacanth, for huge layers of time, does not mean that it was living somewhere on the earth, because they're still alive today. 1938, the front fins or lobes are still fins. It's 100% fish. Nobody disagrees with that. There's the fossil up above. There's the fish, a coelacanth fish. But they really thought they were onto something. They gave up on coelacanth. Some of those other examples I gave you. Finally, 2006, we have Tiktaalik. Evolutionists said the lobe-finned fishes clumsily crawled out of water and onto land 300 to 380 million years ago, like Tiktaalik, a new fossil. Dr. Shubin from the University of Chicago was the lead researcher looking for this fossil. And here's his picture with the fossil, the Tiktaalik. There are actually 3 creatures found. This is the best one. And he's holding it there next to his head, you know, like, this is my buddy. And of course, it helped him get some fame and funding. So supposedly, what did Tiktaalik have? That it could breathe using simple lungs. Dr. Shubin actually said that. The front fins are able to support its weight. That's what all the drawings and pictures used to describe it show. And that there are enough finger-like bones making an arm and a wrist and fingers that are becoming, in those front fins, becoming legs. And then, you know, it has a flattened skull with the eyes on top, you know, like some salamanders or other amphibians. So they're saying this is the perfect transitional form. Not everybody's heard about it, but among evolutionary circles, it's becoming pretty famous, and it's getting into the school books now as well. So I want you to remember this name, Jennifer Clack, because at the time she was considered one of the world's experts on the evolution of fish to amphibians. And so Jennifer Clack, who was not in the actual study group, the finders of the Tiktaalik fossils, but she got all excited about it because this is her field, and she said, Tiktaalik had lobed fins like the coelacanth, and it would have breathed like a lungfish, said Jennifer Clack. But that's based on all the claims Dr. Shubin made and his disclosures. But if you go to the University of Chicago official websites and look at some of the technical papers that the public doesn't always see or hear about, there's no way of knowing if Tiktaalik had lungs based on the fossils. Shubin admits this and explains, well, we think it had on its way to becoming lungs because, well, we needed it to, otherwise it wouldn't exist on land. Not long, it'd flop around like a fish and die. So Shubin admits that this was only an inference, arguably made out of necessity for his theory to fit the story. And without lungs, Tiktaalik would not be a good candidate as a transitional form to land animals. And there is no evidence for lungs. There is evidence for gills shown by these rod-like bones which help pump water over the gills. So a detailed examination of the fossil showed no evidence of lungs, but plenty of evidence for gills. Gills like all fish have, including coelacanths. Second, could those fins really lift up that heavy head? It had, you saw the fossil. There's no connection of those bones in the front fins to the backbone. Any engineer will tell you you got to have some strength there, structure, for that head to be lifted up on those fins. Otherwise, they're going to be worthless. And there are a little bit of bones, just like a coelacanth has bones in its fins, but no connection. Telic and Tiktaalik has no genuine operational hips, shoulders, elbows, wrists, or fingers. It was all a forced fit based on what they wanted to believe. Tiktaalik is clearly another example of a large bottom-dwelling fish. Here's the fossil. Look at it. Look at the size of the fin in the actual fossil. It's very much smaller than almost all Tiktaalik cartoons, animations, and museum models. Compare it. And they've actually used some other animal fossils to reconstruct Tiktaalik, just saying, well, we don't have everything in Tiktaalik, but we've got some initial evidence, but it's not there. Here's one of the models. I've actually saw that model like that, museum in Chicago, Natural History Museum. And they show this creature kind of lifting its head out of the water. But there on the right, you see the actual fossil. That is just imagination. And again, there is absolutely no sign that the few little bones in the fin, which actually can help a fish swim like coelacanth, has no connection to the backbone. Therefore, it's impossible. It's going to lift that heavy head out of the water. The actual fossil front fins are small, flat, no evidence of joints. And the rear fins are almost non-existent. But they just want them to show like they're becoming large and muscular. It's not a transitional form. That cartoon never happened. So remember this. Tiktaalik, could it breathe using simple lungs? No, didn't have simple lungs, it had gills. The front fins, were they able to support its weight, at least just its head, to get out of the water? No, nothing there to do that. Does not have arm, wrist, and finger-like bones. It does have some bones in the fin, and that's it. And the flattened skull with the eyes on top, well, that's true. That is true. But so do other fish today, like flounder. And have you ever heard of a dusky flathead fish? This is a fish that was caught off the coast of Australia. Flathead fish are dorsally compressed. Their body is wide but flattened and very low in height. And both eyes are on top of the flat head. Here's the fossil in the upper right, and here's an actual picture of living flathead fish. They like to sit in shallow waters off the coast. They bury themselves almost in the sand, and then they catch their prey because they can still see good with the eyes on top. Here's another picture of a dusky flathead. I'm going to show you a little video clip. Look how these things behave. This was filmed by Ian Banks. I got this, with all respect, on the internet. It's available, but take a look at how these things hide. And then if they get disturbed, they just take off. And what's interesting, when you really read about the fossil Tiktaalik, I said there were 3 creatures found. One was significant that they like to show. Well, look at the behavior of these fish. They like to sit in clumps, in families perhaps, in the sand, waiting for prey to come by, and then they, swoop up and grab something to eat. But they sit together in the sand, and then when disturbed, they all take off together. If I'm going to speculate, wouldn't it make more sense that 3 or more of these creatures were sitting together in the sand, like this one, very well buried, And at the early stages of the flood, like those Cambrian rocks, later, there was another tsunami of various stages during the flood, and they came in and swooped and buried 3 of them together. Maybe the others escaped, but 3 of them got buried together, and that's exactly what the fossil looks like. It looks like a dusky flathead. It's actually Tiktaalik is what we would call a living fossil, because I think it is a flathead type fish related to these fish, which are nice game fish off the coast of Australia today. Well, remember 2006 is when Tiktaalik came out. Nature magazine, it's a premier science magazine. They put it on their cover when fins became limbs. Just 4 years later, they had to change the story, because in 2010, they talk about 4 feet in the past. Tetrapod trackways from the early Middle Devonian period in Poland. These are the Polish footprints of tetrapods walking on open ground, and these are dated 397 million years ago, and what's now Poland. Wait a minute, Tiktaalik was supposed to be 380 million years old at the most, and it was just developing legs. But now we have Polish footprints, their own dating methods say this is 397, almost 400 million years ago. And it's clear from these fossils, something was walking 18 million years before Tiktaalik, and it was walking on stout legs. Look at those numbers. This is the end. If anybody knows anything about the fossil record, you ought to know about the Polish trackways, and that is the end of Tiktaalik, even if you want to ignore the evidence of what the fossil actually shows. Nature admitted they force a radical reassessment of the timing, ecology, and environmental setting of the fish to tetrapod transition. They force it. All you Tiktaalik fans, why aren't you talking about the Polish footprints? Here they are. Oh, well, this just pushes back evolution. But again, no evidence. Here's how those footprints have been analyzed. It's clearly a creature walking with fully developed skeletal structure, maybe in some mud and a little depth of water, trying to support its weight and to escape maybe an onrushing flood. But this is, again, solid footprints. And any evolutionist who has looked at this agrees. You've got the trackway of a creature with the skeletal structure to support its weight on 4 legs. And it matches the way these creatures walk today. So this is all becoming something different. They still try to give it more fish-like look to it, but that is not true. Tiktaalik is gone, and anything like it. This is truly a walking fish. Remember I said Jennifer Clack, an expert? Well, she looked at these Polish tracks and told the UK Guardian, well, it blows the whole story out of the water, so to speak. Whatever made the tracks in Poland does not look transitional, because they were walking with stout legs. They admit that. So even if you still want to believe in evolution, you cannot use Tiktaalik. First, so much of what was said about it is fraudulent. Second, you've got these tracks of something walking on stout legs. And Jennifer Clack did say, we thought we'd pinned it down. We have to rethink the whole thing. She was the one that was very excited about Tiktaalik. So before she died, she knew that they didn't have anything. So Tiktaalik, the perfect missing link, or just another fish? That's all it is. And no, not a transitional form. And of course, if it's fully fish, it still fits the story. Now, in 2014, Dr. Shubin did try to salvage his discovery that this is Tiktaalik. He tried to do a little further analysis on the rear bones, the pelvic bones that they don't normally show, but they're not pelvic bones because they're attached neither to a spine or a true leg. And there are big fish that have big bones in the back. You just can't, because they're a little bit bigger than most fish, call it the pelvic bones. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to say, well, yeah, I know we've got problems with the front of the fish, but the rear still looks like it's a transitional form. But no, again, it's a contrived story. It simply suggests that the front and hind limbs were equal in size, as is common in modern lobe-finned fishes. I'm going to jump ahead. How many of you heard of Archaeopteryx? Here's the fossil. Here's what they think it looked like. Actually, it looks more like a bird to me. It's got fully formed feathers. Now, here's the thing. The Archaeopteryx fossil is supposed to have lived about 150 million years ago, maybe 120 to 150 million. But T-Rex and dinosaurs lived up to 65 million years ago. So I've got fully formed feathers, wings, and a wishbone structure in a creature that looks like a bird, almost twice as old as T-Rex and other dinosaurs that today they're trying to glue feathers onto, which is a ridiculous anti-science thing to do. So what about Archaeopteryx? Well, I mentioned it's in the wrong sequence. It's too old. For one thing, birds are found earlier in the fossil record than the dinosaurs they're supposed to have descended from, says Dr. Rubin. And that's a pretty serious problem. And there are other consistencies with the bird to dinosaur theories. This was published in Science Daily in 2009. Archaeopteryx. You know, you've got a bird, it's got a respiratory system that's a complete redesign because it's a pump flow-through system and not in and out bellows system like all mammals and land creatures have. And the walking with the use of the femur bone on the hip is totally different in birds. You ever watch birds go? Well, they've got that femur bone tucked up. And they've got a hollow bone structure for as if it was designed to be less weight so it can fly. You've got the finger developed, you got the wrong digits that became the claws of a bird are different than the claws of a dinosaur. And the complexities of the feathers themselves. Wow, they are complex. They are not like scales on some reptile or amphibian or some perhaps dinosaur type. It's totally, completely different structure, and they grow completely different than hide does. And again, Archaeopteryx is too old. But I've seen places like National Geographic where they just kind of play with the numbers and put it in the right sequence because they want you to believe it came from a dinosaur. Alan Fiducia is not only a paleontologist, he's an expert on bird anatomy. And he said some time ago, Archaeopteryx probably cannot tell us much about the early origins of feathers and flight and true proto-bird because Archaeopteryx was, in a modern sense, a bird. Paleontologists have tried to turn Archaeopteryx into an earthbound feathered dinosaur, but it's not. It's a perching bird. And no amount of paleo babble is going to change that. You've got to change the sequence. You've got to come up with a whole story of where feathers come. Because yes, we do have feathered creatures in the dinosaur record, but they're fully feathered. They're birds. And dinosaurs, real dinosaurs, according to the classification, have no feathers. They have skin, they have pieces of collagen, which some people interpret as birds, or as feathers, excuse me. Well, let's tackle one more issue. Remember, Tiktaalik or whoever, whatever animal you want to pick, they need a transition of when animals evolved in the sea and then decided to walk on land. Again, they don't have a good story there. Tiktaalik is not a good candidate because of the actual fossil bones and because of the Polish footprints. But, you know, they've got to have a lot of stories. And one of the stories is some animal on land, fully adapted, you know, now living on the land, decides it likes the taste of fish and goes back into the water and in millions of years turns into a blue whale. Holy cow, talk about a fish story. I wanted to see some real evidence here. And again, you know, they try to manufacture it with pieces of bones. One thing that came up in the late 1990s was a fossil called Pakicetus. It's supposed to have been maybe a bear-like or a wolf-like creature that really wanted to eat fish, and it's diving into the water, and by pure imagination, it evolves into a porpoise or a seal, something that wants to eat fish. And those legs, which used to have to evolve from fins to legs, the legs are now going back to fins. They have to have a story because we have mammals that live in the sea. Mammals like sea lions, porpoises, all kinds of whales, they're mammals. And they're designed to live in the sea. Certainly look designed, if you know anything about design, because they work and they function very well in the sea. But they need a story that a land-like creature, and one candidate was Pakicetus. Well, this is what they actually had. They only had the gray sections from the skull, the back of the skull, a few teeth, and a little part of the lower jaw. That's all they had. And then look at the picture on the left. That's what the artists were told to draw. Oh, it's becoming a sea lion and then a porpoise and who knows what else. It's pure imagination. Here it's written, small, dog-like appearance. If you stumbled across this small, dog-like sized Pakicetus 50 million years ago, you could never have guessed that its descendants would include giant sperm whales and gray whales today. Yeah, you're right. I would never guess that. How about you? Would you really? If you weren't taught this in advance? Well, 3 years after Pakicetus came out, a lot more of the bones were discovered in 2001, and it revealed that Pakicetus was primarily a land animal, about the size of a wolf. Oh, maybe it was a canine type creature, a type of wolfhound. And it had fully formed legs for living on the land and not in the sea. It's a whale of a tale. I can't go into all the details. We don't have time for that. But it's pure silliness. There are too many changes. The nostrils at the end of a snout. You have a dog at home, whether it's a big snout or a long one, the nostrils are up there. Where do porpoises and whales have their blowholes? On top of the head. Man, that would have to cause a lot of interference with the brain and the eyes if that thing was going to slowly move. And why would it move if it's already formed and works well on land? With great sense of smell. Why would a dog or a bear-like thing want to become a porpoise? And they don't have enough time. I mean, they're talking only about tens of millions of years here. And evolution doesn't work that fast if you really understand it. Natural selection does appear to cause changes, like we talked about the cats fast, but you never get anything but cats. Wolfhounds is the same story. We've bred dogs that ladies can carry in their purse. And we've got big wolfhounds, and we've got wolves and foxes. They're all related, but none of them are going to turn into a porpoise or an eagle. This is from National Geographic, which is not a peer-reviewed journal. It's basically run by people today who hate creationists. So they keep using it, and they keep distorting the evidence that how these creatures slowly turn into a amphibian, and it's imagination. I saw a quote in a video clip of a professor of evolution, and this professor said, the problem with creation is you don't have enough imagination. Oh, well, I have imagination, but I know where imagination stops and the facts begin. Remember that, folks. This is folklore, and it won't go away because they need a story. First for a fish to walk on land, and then the land creature to jump back in the water. We talked about this, about invertebrates. They make up the vast majority of the fossil record. Almost 95% of all fossils are plant animals and plants that come from the sea. They're all over the place. 95% all fossils come from the sea, kind of like a flood event, maybe. and they're buried throughout the fossil record. And then the rest of some of the other stuff is like plants and algae, and only a small portion of the fossil records includes insects and no evidence of evolution, how all of these types of animals happen. There is no transformation here. I'm going to move on. I've already talked about plants, but this is still true. To the unprejudiced, the fossil record of plants is in favor of special creation, and so it is of animals. Folks, Darwin was right in terms of saying this is the biggest argument you can use against his theory, the lack of transitional forms. And there should be hundreds of thousands of bona fide transitional forms in the fossil record if his theory was true. But we don't have much. We've got what? A dozen? Want to be generous? 2 dozen? Controversial examples? Tiktaalik is no transitional form. It's a flat-head fish, just like are alive today. Pakicetus was a dog or a wolfhound of some type. The fossil record shows that Darwinian evolution did not happen. It's not there. Darwin is right. It's still a big argument against his theory. But what does it show? Well, let's go back to Dr. Gould. The extreme rarity of the transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. What I've tried to do with you today is blow away some of these secrets. And the evolutionary trees that do adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest was inference. Remember that word? Yeah, he thinks it's reasonable because he already believes in evolution, but it's not compelling for somebody who's a skeptic. I'm very skeptical that you can go from a fish to an amphibian to a T-Rex, no matter how much you want to believe in it. I don't think that's reasonable. But they think it's reasonable if you've already believed in evolution. But the key point is the rest is inference. Where do we have the data? Where do we have the facts of science? Only at the tips and nodes of Darwin's evolutionary tree. So here's a stylized version of Darwin's tree. We got a simple cell, happens to be dividing there at the bottom, and that simple cell turns into everything, not just plants and fish and birds, but all the other types of living things. That's a fantastic story. I'd like to have fantastic proof. Do we have it? No, we've got data only at the tips and nodes of Darwin's evolutionary tree, and the rest is inference, and that's still true today. It's inference. Inference is what? Well, you could call it an educated guess and be kind, but it's not data. I'm guessing. I'm filling in the blanks. It's a story based on what I already believe. So let's stick to the facts. Let's pull out the inference. And what do we have left? Let's straighten out what we have left, what the facts of the data from the fossil record show. We're going to flatten it out. Oh, and the evidence shows God's creation orchard. This accommodates natural selection with the branching within a single tree. It fits what we see in the fossil record, no transitional forms between all the major groups, and it fits genetics. Got to remember these different branches of science. Modern genetics, Darwin had no idea about that. But the more we've learned about DNA and all the information that has to be collected in DNA, has to happen. I need that information to change a fin into a leg and into a wing. That is a ton of information all by itself. And modern genetics does not allow for that. In fact, we know today that mutations cannot do what evolutionists want them to do. Of course, you have to see my talk on genetics and the Bible. But I'm telling you this, the fossil record fits the creation orchard and not Darwin's tree of life. And it's not just Genesis that contradicts Darwin's story. It's 1 Corinthians 15 in the New Testament, where it's written, "For not all flesh is alike, but there is one kind for men, another for animals, another for birds, and another for fish. Nothing in between. Today, we know that's because of DNA. DNA doesn't allow that. DNA is why animals reproduce after their own kind. And the same thing for plants. Folks, Colossians 2:8 says, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ. Yes, there are certain things that are true in science that they mention, but then they extrapolate that into a crazy story of a simple cell turning into T-Rexes and oak trees and fish and all kinds of other creatures. Those elementary principles are deceiving you because of the way they're twisted. They're based on a philosophy and empty deception. Christ is our creator and our savior. Please remember that. And if you don't know Christ, invite him into your heart. That's the way to live life in this world and to overcome the problems of sin and to look forward to a life in a new heaven, a new earth, that there is no sin and disease, death, or die. So we're looking for a change in people. Not that above change or a fish can walk on land, but this change below. When we look at the facts, we can drop those supposed fish-like fins turning into legs, according to Darwin, and accept Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. You see, the Bible has stood the test of time and science. You can trust it from the very first verse. Don't forget that. Get into a Bible study. Go learn a little bit more about what the Creator has to say. Thank you. I really appreciate this chance to be with you, Donny, and everybody else that sees this video or is online now. But I do sell this thumb drive. I don't have DVDs anymore. I don't have this talk. Well, I have a portion of this talk on fossils. I also have carbon-14, age of the earth. I have chimp versus human DNA. I do have human genetics in the Bible, atheism, and a few other talks. 7 major talks. So instead of, buying 7 DVDs, you get it all on one thumb drive, plus some short videos that are just excellent from other scientists. And then we have some PDF documents that I've written. Send an email to me, info@creationtn.org, info@creationtn.org, and tell me you want to order this. I can send you an invoice with a credit card link, and I will mail you this thumb drive at a special price of $42, free shipping in the US. Send me that email. We also have on hand some DVDs, if you do have a DVD player. Both of these feature interviews of many great scientists, PhDs from major universities and international ones, that talk about why they believe the Bible and not Darwin. Great stuff. Dismantle is a relatively new one. It's being translated into German. So if you have any German speakers in your family or your overseas friends, I'm going to be distributing that in a beautifully done, dubbed version in German of Dismantle. And of course, Evolution's Achilles Heels is available from CMI, as well as you can order it from me. Just send me that email. Tell me if you're interested in that. But hey, that's my story. That's what I think I have time for. Donny, I appreciate the chance.
Thank you, Helmut. Wow. That was excellent. That was comprehensive. Archaeopteryx, Tiktaalik, whale evolution, problems with plant evolution. And so I appreciate how much work and study you clearly put into that presentation. I would say that's a must watch right there. And so great work.
Well, thank you. Cheers.
So, yes, cheers. Well, we got quite a few questions here from the audience. And one question that I have based on... Pardon?
Should I stop sharing?
Oh, yeah. I took your slides off the screen so we can... Yeah, looks good. So your thorough rebuttal to Tiktaalik. Excellent points. I love how detailed you were, especially considering the fact that both Tiktaalik and whale evolution, the whale series from Pakicetus, Ambulocetus up to modern whales, is still frequently employed as major arguments today. And so oftentimes what I'll see as a response to Tiktaalik, you made several great points, one specifically about the tetrapod foot tracks in Poland that predate Tiktaalik by about 20 million years according to the conventional timeline.
Their own numbers, 18 to 20.
Right. And so I've seen evolutionists and evolutionary scientists say, argue, okay, that was a bit of a surprise to find. But as we know today, domestic dogs, which many would argue came from wolves, can still coexist at the same time as creatures that they descend from. And so they will assert basically that Tiktaalik can still be the transitional form they're looking for, even though they're true tetrapods living prior. What would be a good response to that, Helmut?
I'm sorry, I was looking at the questions here.
Oh, no
We still say Tiktaalik is what?
Well, they would still argue that Tiktaalik can still be a good example of a transitional form, in the same way that today domestic dogs coexist with wolves, even though many, and I think as creationists, go ahead. I think you know where I'm going with that.
Dogs and wolves are so similar, you can get them to breed. You're not going to get an amphibian breed with a fish, are you? Come on. Tiktaalik does not have the features it needs to lift that head out of the water. It does not have any sign of a lung. It has the signs of fin. So that's why gills. So, those are the facts you got to hang on to. And the whole story of a fish deciding to walk on land is silly. It's not science. It's silly. Yes, I understand good scientists, honest people do believe it, but that's more a case of a life of indoctrination than really looking at the facts. Even Jennifer Clack had to give up on Tiktaalik because of the Polish prince. That seals it. That's icing on the cake.
Right. We got true tetrapods existing prior to the so-called fishapod. That would be the transition from fish to amphibians or tetrapods. And so, okay, that's great. So here's a question. We got a good mix in the chat of skeptics and non-skeptics.
Yeah.
And so here's a question here from Base Theory. And he's asking, how were evolutionary scientists able to predict these transitional anatomies before they are discovered?
Well, it's kind of an after the fact prediction. I understand they were looking at that because they thought that's where they might find it. But you got to remember, they didn't find it. Don't let the question twist you around. How can they predict these transitional things? But they weren't discovered. The whole question is illogical based on facts, isn't it? So yes, they still have this prediction, but they didn't find anything. Got it?
Right. Isn't the question assuming that transitional anatomies were discovered in the first place, Helmut?
Well, it assumes that they did discover them.
Right.
Because the last clause of the question is before they are discovered. They can predict lots of things, but that doesn't mean they're actually finding any of these things. They can predict so many things, and usually what they find contradicts their prediction. So often, without telling you, they change their predictions. So it's a really bad case of circular reasoning here.
Right. I think you nailed it in your presentation when you pointed out that there should be there should be thousands to millions of true transitional fossils that leave us with no doubt. But the fact that we argue about a few controversial ones like Tiktaalik, which you demonstrated is not transitional, the whale series, Archaeopteryx, at best, I think
that's an excellent point.
Mm-hmm.
We have to remember that Darwin predicted, why isn't every strata of rocks full of transitional forms? And everybody admits they're not. Remember, It's the trade secret of paleontology. the public's only given their handful of examples that they say this evolved into that. But when you get into the details, as you should, if you want to believe this story, the story falls apart.
That's right. So here's a good question. You talked about early on in your presentation, Helmut, about the Cambrian explosion, that we got this sudden appearance of all of these phyla, these sophisticated body plans, sudden appearance of coral, jellyfish, trilobites with their sophisticated eye system. And so as a response, typically from evolutionists, and it looks like this is one of their responses, Taylor Kay, who's a creationist, but she says she's heard evolutionists argue that the reason why there aren't many fossils prior to this Cambrian explosion is because those animals were soft-bodied and didn't leave fossils, which explains the lack of transitions. Is this correct? She's wondering.
No, you can't use that argument because the Cambrian explosion is full of soft-bodied creatures. So we have soft-bodied creatures. That's kind of a, an appeal to nothing. We do have fossilized soft creatures. In fact, Darwin predicted we would never find soft creatures because he thought all the fossils would have, something hard, a bone or, a shell. But we have fossils of jellyfish.
Right.
By the hundreds and thousands that have been found across the US and Canada. Jellyfish. Yeah, they're very soft. Did you ever see a dead one on the beach and chop it up with a stick or something? They're very soft and they are fossilized and they look exactly like modern jellyfish. So the whole story of, okay, that's just an excuse that doesn't hold water at all. I saw somebody named Ian. He talked about the reason animal life first evolved in the seas is because there was no oxygen on the land. Well, you have to have oxygen atmosphere for the land, for the waters to pick up and be distributed so that the fish and other creatures can get it through their gills and other structures. They pull the oxygen out of the water. But secondly, the whole myth of a great oxygenation event, I addressed this in my talk on the atheism and the origin of life. To have the origin of life, they know because of the chemicals involved, you have to have an Earth that's only a reducing atmosphere, no oxygen in the atmosphere. And there is zero evidence that Earth ever had a reducing atmosphere. All the ancient rocks by geologists and others who still believe in evolution, but they admit the ancient rocks up to 1 billion or more, 3 billion years old, have the sign of oxygen in the atmosphere and in the seas. They were all formed in an oxygen-rich planet. Earth never had a reducing atmosphere. That's what the record shows. And that eliminates the atheistic idea of chemicals forming into the first living cell. Of course, that's only one reason it's impossible. There's several more.
Wow. You demonstrate why at the You demonstrate exactly why it's a great time to be a biblical creationist, Helmut. That's a fantastic answer. And I find the rescue device on the Cambrian explosion to be funny because, as you pointed out, we do find soft-bodied creatures like jellyfish in the Cambrian, but yet they want to say, well, the reason we don't find the ancestors leading up to these creatures is because they all would have been soft-bodied. But we, as you pointed out, we find soft-bodied creatures even in the Cambrian.
We can identify fossils of bacteria.
Right.
And there's a few of those that are in the granites. So there might have been some cases where bacteria, before the flood, they get fossilized, but no multicellular creatures. Oh, by the way, that's another tough transition. Did you ever think about the genetics to go from a simple cell, one cell creature that does everything, to a multi-celled creature? Many cells dividing up the labors of taking in food, processing it, and then spitting out the waste products. How does that happen? They have no story there either, to go from a simple cell, single cell, to multi-cells. Every major transition from the tiniest on has significant problems. Problems that Darwin could never even imagine, but we know them today. Are we going to believe in modern science? If you want to believe in modern science, you cannot escape God.
Amen.
That story.
What are your thoughts on the evolutionary appeal to the ordering of the fossil record? They might even acknowledge, okay, we don't have that many transitional forms, but the general order from, you know, the bottom layer to the top layer is fish to amphibian to reptile to mammal and eventually man, isolated on the top. And so they argue that's evolutionary progression, large scale evolution. Helmut, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you still have the gaps, but the best answer is that the fossil record, the geological column, is more a record of habitat and what was the sequence of burial in the year-long flood event. That is still the best way to interpret all the sedimentary rocks full of dead things around the world, is that there really was Noah's flood. We'll have to have a talk on that sometime.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so a question here on whale evolution, which again, I appreciate how thorough you were there. So evolutionists, as you know, argue that whales have vestigial hind legs. So they'll look at fossil whales like Basilosaurus and they'll point to the really small hind legs. And then today, modern whales like a blue whale, they'll say they got even smaller hind legs. And so evidence that they used to walk on land. Question is, are these actually leftover remnants of the history of whale ancestry, Helmut?
No, they're not, but they really are like all vestigial organs. Remember, that was an argument for Darwin 120 years ago, is that there is almost a list of almost 100 vestigial organs in humans and some creatures like these whales' legs or bones in the back of their bodies that were vestigial, no longer necessary. But every one, modern medicine has shown every one of the vestigial organs in humans is necessary, including your appendix and your tonsils and so on. They are useful in life, or at least some part of your life, because you got to remember a lot of these things are going on when you're still forming in your mommy's womb. And as far as the rear bones, those are useful. Those are necessary. It's how whales give birth. They're like stiffeners. They're like a structure designed in the back of a whale. It helps whales in mating, and it helps them, the mom, to give birth. They are not vestigial hind legs. They are a necessary feature designed into the anatomy of whales, important for their survival today. Okay? Does that help?
Great answer. Yeah, we got a functional feature in reproduction. And so evolution is all about passing on genes, reproduction, survival of the fittest. And so what happened before these hind legs were co-opted or transitioned into a functional appendage for reproduction? How were these whales reproducing is what I'd like to know from the evolution.
Stiffeners for the just to hold the body to get close together. But they are very important in when a mom whale, calves a baby whale. They have a purpose, and there has no connection to the backbone. They're actually used, so it's not a vestigial organ at all.
Do you think there's variation that, Helmut, just like we see variation in all kinds of creatures, as you've demonstrated in your presentation with the created kinds, we see a diversity of whales. So in the fossil record, we got Basilosaurus, for example. Today, we got blue whales and other types of whales. And so the reason why we might see so-called vestigial hind limbs that are functional, as you put it, that are maybe varied in the fossil record is just because there's a variation of whales in general. So we'd expect those components to vary, because oftentimes the evolutionists will look to the fossil whales and say, well, they're more prominent. Those so-called vestigial hind limbs, they're larger, they're more prominent, and so they're reducing over time.
Those are I think those are more conjecture. and what actual bones will actually survive.
Hmm.
I don't think we can't always guess at the rest of the body structure, the soft parts that would have been there.
Right.
So that's, that's grasping at a final straw. You got to have a whole pile of solid evidence and not just guessing at things. And that's the thing here. So many arguments for evolution over the last 120 years have been based on ignorance. Oh, we didn't know what these vestigial organs did. We didn't know about what they do, so therefore they must be proof of our evolutionary past. It's like um, junk DNA
Right.
that was held up as evidence of evolution. Oh, those are just vestigial portions of your DNA that must have been used when you had a tail or swung from trees. It's leftovers of your evolutionary past. Well, today, we know that was just an argument out of ignorance because we didn't know what they were doing. But today, in the last 10 years, we know that those are all important controlling genes that control other genes. It's very important. So there are no vestigial organs. And just because you don't need a left arm, could you chop off your left arm? Could you live? Sure you can.
Yeah.
Does that mean it's a vestigial organ?
Yeah.
That's an extreme
No.
example. I understand
Right.
that. But it's the type of thing that if we don't know what it does, it must be a proof of evolution. But it's an argument from ignorance. And then later, like even the whale bones or our appendix, we find out later, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, that's important. You couldn't have survived in your mommy's womb and be born without the appendix doing what it does,
Right.
creating the first blood cells and so on, and then holding on to very important good bacteria that your digestive system needs. So yeah, they all have purposes. Just because we don't know it doesn't mean it proves evolution.
Well, you mentioned junk DNA, and as you put it, there are no vestigial organs, structures. In the past, they used to think there's about 140 to 200 of them. As you pointed out, we've got a known function for basically all of them. And so now they're applying the same debunked argument to our genetics. And they argue there are vestigial genes, junk DNA. And so one argument for whale evolution comes from genetics. And they'll argue that baleen whales, so they got those bristles instead of teeth, once had teeth because they, and this is their assertion, they have broken genes or pseudogenes for teeth. And so they typically ask the question, why would God create non-functional tooth genes in whales that completely lack teeth?
How do you know that they were designed for teeth? Maybe they were, maybe they're doing something else in the development of that whale. A lot of this is we just don't know. I have, to be honest, I haven't heard this argument. But again, it's so minor and it's so based on we don't know for sure. How do you know those are pseudogenes that were designed for teeth? They look similar, maybe. Maybe there was some variation, but it doesn't mean it evolved from a wolf standing on the seashore. That's a stretch, isn't it?
It is.
And it doesn't say God would create non-functional tooth genes because we're not sure that those genes did something different in the development of a whale. We make so many statements that are conjecture, take it as truth, and then try to beat that creationist over the head with it when you really don't know what you're talking about.
Junk DNA is junk science. And so because we know so little about the DNA language, we're learning more every single day. We understand that over 80% of the genome is active, at least 60% transcribed into RNA, and that these pseudogenes are necessary to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. And so, like you put it, why are we going to assume that these are truly broken genes, quote unquote, that used to be used?
Now there is such a thing as broken genes, but they're mutations. Right. And so these is this a mutation form that's no longer functional, not because it's evolving or had an evolutionary past, but because it once did have a real function, and now it's mutated and lost its purpose. And that's what mutations tell us. If you get into genetics, there is no process to create new and better information. The only thing that's happening in mutations an understanding of mutations shows that things are deteriorating. So, I suppose there is a chance that these are non-functional genes, at least in an adult whale as we see it today. There's a chance of that, but that doesn't mean it had an evolutionary past. That's a big leap that you're trying to force on a little piece of data
Right.
that could mean something else. And again, it's only because of your assumption, your belief system, not because it's compelling evidence. You still have to answer to those Polish footprints and where did whales come from, and where and these lack of evidence that some dog or bear-like creature wanted to go back into the water. You've got so many things that have to change in the DNA, and it has to be good changes that program how to do these massive transitions in not just the exterior. Evolutionists especially look too much at just the exterior. Oh, the arm and the fin, they look so much alike. And yeah, there's a few bones that are similar, and they try to talk about how this changed into that. Well, where'd that information in the DNA come from? And what about all the tendons, the connections, the muscles, the nerve endings? Everything has to be perfectly designed to fit and work. So it's just, you got to separate imagination from what we really know. And so much of evolution is dependent on an overly active imagination.
Yeah, I mean, evolutionists hope, dream, and imagine that. Well, it's kind of interesting that supposedly, as you were explaining in your presentation, you have a fish that comes out of the water, evolves into an amphibian, and then a reptile, then a mammal, and then the mammal decides to go back in the water and evolve into a whale. That's some pretty intense storytelling. Am I right, Helmut?
It's very big storytelling. It's like Rudyard Kipling's what are those, the what so stories? It's just storytelling. Yeah, you try to put it into a scientific context, but do you have scientific evidence that fits, that really proves this? No. Remember, it's inference, conjecture in the fossil, in the Darwin simple tree. But the facts confirm, not just from the fossils, but from genetics, that God's creation orchard is what we really see in this world.
Amen. So here's a common objection. So this comes in from the book warden. He says, I've heard that if God was real, so many evolutionists or naturalists will make this argument, our bodies would be better. What is Welke's insight on this? Are we physically corrupted by the fall?
Well, the short answer is yes, we are. That's what mutations are all about. They're copying mistakes. They happen for different reasons, and radiation can speed them up. But just simple, reproduction causes copying mistakes. We now know that, at least among humans, every generation has 100 or so more mutations than their parents, and that compounds. They don't go away, and that's why we are deteriorating. It's why we age. But also the robustness of our DNA is declining. It's not because there's a lot of junk DNA there, but what was once good and helpful DNA has now got a lot of copying mistakes in it. Some are inconsequential, but geneticists call this the genetic burden or the genetic load. Every generation has more. And so the genetics is to look at this honestly. It's why we have more genetic diseases today than ever before. In the last 20 years, we've identified thousands more, not just because of better science, there's some of that, sure, but because we are deteriorating. Our DNA, the DNA of people from ancient Greek or Rome has been shown to have been more robust, more strength, fewer mutations. Mutations degrade. And that's what's happening to us. It's not like God made our bodies the way it is today. He made our bodies perfect. When sin entered the world, that's when mutations started happening. It's why Adam and Eve aged, albeit slowly. But it also fits a exponential decline in the ages of the patriarchs in the Bible to genetic decay that we can see and discuss and experiment on and simulate today. It fits. Our DNA robustness is going down, not up. And that's why God didn't create us as we are today. We've got thousands of years of mutations creeping in, genetic diseases getting more and more often, and we are headed towards extinction, which is, I think, one reason Jesus is coming back before that does happen.
Amen. I agree. And so these deleterious mutations that you're talking about that are largely disease causing, damaging, these are what are supposed to contribute to, for example, whale evolution, changing your forelimbs into flippers, changing in the birthing process. But yet these are novel anatomical changes in many ways.
They're major changes.
Right.
And so, you've got to think about all the changes in the DNA, not just in what the proteins code for, but for all of those controlling genes. There is no such thing as junk DNA. There's controlling genes that control other genes that control other genes. And when they have problems, that kind of what leads to cancer growth. Because the controls that says, okay, reproduce, make this type of protein, but now stop, those instructions get mixed up. So we are declining. It's a sad story, but it's a result of sin. And that's why Jesus died for us, to get us over our sin and to make us eligible, because we have to have no sin to come into God's presence in a future heaven and earth. And we can only do that by having our sin forgiven. We cannot earn our salvation. You can do all the 5 pillars of Islam, and they will never say that guarantees you to heaven. No, it doesn't. Muslims will agree to that. You can do everything that Hinduism, any other religion said. You can throw virgins into a volcano like they did thousands of years ago to appease the God, because they know that God is disappointed in our sin. Sin is serious. And we live in a culture that doesn't want to take it serious. And our best, our most wonderful, our most loving out is to have our sin forgiven by our Creator. That's awesome. When you think about the love of God, that He would go to those steps and invade human history, rise from the dead, and make it possible to have our sins wiped out so that we can come into the presence of God. That's the good news. And that's why it's important that we, dispel some of these other myths, like such as Darwin's evolutionary story, which try to supplant God. And if we get rid of that, we can begin to see the truth of the Bible, not just of Genesis, but Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Amen.
Amen. Beautiful. It's a free gift. Every other religion, there's something you have to do, as you put it with Islam. But with Christianity, it's done. It's finished. It's a free gift.
Now we are to live out our salvation, because just appreciation for what God has done for us and His love and His guidance He can give us through the Holy Spirit. But that's not what earns it. We've had our sins forgiven. That's what does it.
Amen.
And the free gift of God is that He died for us while we were yet sinners. That's how God shows His love for us. And the science matches the creation account. It matches the decline of our genome, the sin entering the world. The whole story fits the biblical account much better. Why not accept it and embrace it and live the life God wants you to? It is the way to live life. The Bible's the handbook for life.
Amen.
And
it
to
really
know
is. Our hope is not in this world, brother. Our hope is in heaven. I've heard evolutionary science. I'm just curious as to your opinion. I have a feeling I know what you're going to say, but evolutionary scientists are so adamant. They say, okay, when we compare the genetics of hippos and whales, they're very close. And hippos give birth to live young underwater. Hippos also have, from my understanding, internal reproductive organs in the same way that whales do. And so they must share a common ancestor, whales and hippos, because of these observations. What are your thoughts, Helmut?
Well, the genetically the genetic evidence for that to have happened is not there. And
Right.
just because things are similar doesn't mean they evolved one into another. That's just storytelling. It just means, you look at the way a hippo lives. It lives mostly on land. It does its thing in the water, but they're designed to do that, and they're designed to do that well.
Hmm.
And whales, they can survive and reproduce by the thousands and live very well deep water. So what you're trying to do is take things that are similar and then pronounce evolution on them. It's like taking a knife, a spoon, and a fork. Oh, one evolved into another. Look, a knife, it's just a straight piece of metal, has a little sharper edge. But then over time, one edge of it flattened out and made a little bowl-like structure over time. That changed into a spoon. And then over time, that spoon, that bowl-like structure at the end split apart, and you've got the prongs of a fork. That evolved. That's what you're doing. Just because things have some similarity, you are forgetting the genetics that has to change the building program in the DNA to make all that possible and to do all the details correctly. Otherwise, it also is storytelling.
That's right. A lot of storytelling, especially with fossils. Fossils are fickle. They can tell or sing any story that you want them to. Isn't that right?
That's what they do, but their interpretation is not fixed in stone. Remember that.
You take hippos and whales, their bodies have to perform a lot of the
If
same
you see
functions.
somebody saying I'm being stupid with the knife, fork, and spoon, I'm telling you that the hippo and whale is stupid. That's what I'm trying to illustrate.
Right.
I know the knife, the spoon, the fork evolution is stupid, but it's an illustration of the stretch you're trying to make by putting a few things that are similar and then saying they evolved by themselves and all the genetics changed and made sense. That is a stretch. Don't call me stupid unless you can defend the genetics of all that happening. You can disagree with me, but don't call me stupid because you're just showing your own ignorance.
That's right. You can see how, what's the word I want to use? Sensitive evolutionists get when they see their evolutionary philosophy being exposed. Because you did. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, finish that.
I was going to say, because you demonstrated or you showed what they believe in the beginning of your presentation, which I like, because you're setting the foundation for what's going to be discussed. And those that believe in universal common descent do truly believe that they as humans are related to strawberries, banana plants, whales, but they want to call us ignorant.
Yeah. All I'm saying is I'm appealing to the facts of science, not the storytelling that goes with a few facts. Dig a little deeper and again, think of all the details and the changes that have to change in the blueprints of life.
Right.
That all has to be done correctly for the whale to be able to do that, and that the whales can give birth underwater and the baby whale knows exactly what to do and then swim up to the surface and start breathing. That's amazing. And I don't see that happening by chance without billions of whales drowning. First, how are they going to evolve if they're drowning?
Right. So, because you were talking about deleterious mutation accumulation earlier, then we have these necessary increases in phenotypic complexity and anatomy. Is there therefore, Helmut, a waiting time problem to accumulate this amount of beneficial mutations that'll lead to these changes anyways?
Oh yeah, that's a big one. It is actually called the wait time problem. Wait being W-A-I-T. The Dr. Sanford even published in a secular genetics journal the results of a series of simulations, and they showed the open code of the simulation, and nobody had any problems with it. They looked at it, and then they walked away. The wait time problem is big and it's severe. Just to get enough mutations that take you from a chimp to a human, you're talking tens of thousands, no, millions, a million or more correct changes in the DNA. And just to go 5 nucleotides to make them in the correct correction by mutation, you have to remember it's not just a chance mutation occurs. If that happens, let's say in a male chimp, the right mutation of a series of just 5 nucleotides, which isn't much, but they've got to be correct and survivable. If that happens, it can't just happen in one male one time, 1 out of a million chance. It's got to happen in a female who's nearby. It's got to be then established in a population. The wait time problem addresses this because you've got all these changes to go to a chimp to human, and the difference is much more than 15%. It's not 2% like they used to say. They know that. Difference between chimp and human DNA is massive. Millions of nucleotides have to change and be changed correctly, and it takes time for it to become established in the whole population of chimps or whatever transitional form you pick. And that wait time problem has been published in secular scientific journals as being immense. To change 5 nucleotides took 1 billion years.
Wow.
You don't have enough evolutionary time to do all that. The universe isn't old enough to just go off the change. All the changes necessary from a chimp to a human. It is ridiculous to keep teaching that. It's anti-science. That's what it is. Because I don't want to give up my faith system that excludes God. That's the only reason. That's the only reason. Give me the science. You don't have it if you're an evolutionist and trying to explain everything without God. As I said, if you really believe in science and you want to get into the details of genetics, the fossils, everything else, modern biology, microbiology, biochemistry, you cannot escape God. Okay?
You nailed it. I heard Dr. John Sanford, who published in the secular literature on the waiting time problem, as you're explaining, in his lecture at the National Institute for Health. He pointed out how over 10,000 scientists, if I remember correctly, read that paper on the waiting time problem. It's a rock solid paper, no counters, no rebuttals, and it's published in the conventional literature.
It is. Yeah, because it was just pure science, pure simulation with the open code. They could find no flaws in it. It works. And it's a problem. And it's just one of many proofs or rock solid evidences that evolution cannot happen and did not happen.
If you can't show us how it happened through genetics, like mutations, natural selection, environment, then don't tell us that it did happen by lining up a bunch of bones found in the dirt. Because then they're just imposing their evolutionary philosophy on those historical reconstructions, aren't they, Helmut?
Exactly. They wanted so hard for things to fall into place for them, but they're not. And unfortunately, in academia today, you cannot admit that publicly.
Right.
Privately, they have no choice, I think. But publicly, your peers or your bosses will take away your funding. If you have tenure, you won't get fired, probably, but you start losing funding and getting uncomfortable. It's the same thing. So, yeah, it's a tough situation where a very poor scientific supposed idea has taken control of people's minds, and they don't want to hear the counterpoints. True science means we can discuss these things and point out things like the bone structure of Tiktaalik does not support lifting up its head, that there's no sign of rudimentary lungs, only gills, that it looks like a dusky flathead fish.
Right.
They don't want to talk about that because they don't really have much of a rebuttal, for one thing, and it counteracts their story. That's the sad part. Okay, it does counteract your story. Maybe you should reconsider your story.
As we start to wind things down, Helmut, I appreciate how comprehensive you are on these important questions. And just with your presentation, anybody just joining us, please, you have to go back once we're done here, watch the presentation. Helmut does a fantastic job addressing Tiktaalik, which I think I'm going to turn into its own clip. Helmut, whale evolution, Archaeopteryx goes into plant evolution, and share this around. It's important. So as we start to wind it down, I am curious if you're familiar with the argument that biologos, I've seen evolutionary scientists line up embryos between a dolphin and a human, and they'll say that the dolphin, it seems more like an inference, maybe it's a false inference, but they'll say that the dolphin embryo in the beginning stages grows arm and leg buds, but then eventually those are reabsorbed. But in humans, you have the leg and arm buds that eventually grow into arms and legs. And they're saying, well, so that means the dolphin must have at some point had an ancestor with legs and arms, being a tetrapod. What would be your thoughts on that?
Why? Why does that must? Why does that have to be? There's so much we really don't know. The whole idea of embryonic recapitulation, whether in humans or dolphins, has been proven to be so wrong and just anti-science. Even Stephen Gould said this is crap that got into our textbooks, and once it's in a textbook, it's so hard to get it out again. That's the issue. And so they're just grasping at straws. You pointing out one thing because these buds get absorbed, maybe they had another purpose there in its development. That takes more research. Right. I'm not that familiar with it, I'll admit, but it just sounds like another fish story. You're grasping at stories because you don't have a comprehensive story that fits all the facts of microbiology, biochemistry, genetics, and the fossils. It's probably another argument from ignorance.
Just like the junk DNA, the vestigial organs. Correct me if I'm wrong, if we were to take two different cars from two different manufacturing companies, maybe a truck from GM and a car from Chrysler's, the early stages of manufacturing, everything's going to be pretty similar, I'd understand. But as the manufacturing process proceeds, then you're going to see the biggest differences. And then eventually you have the end product. We have a sedan and a truck, which are very different. And that's what we would see with a dolphin and a human, even if there may be some similarities in early embryological development.
Well, yeah, we've all got to start somewhere.
Right.
But you're forcing a belief system on a few facts that that belief system has already been contradicted by other facts.
Right.
So clinging to one or two minor stories doesn't really help you. In fact, it makes a pretty sad situation that you're in. That if you're going to cling to a story with one or two little things that might maybe indicate your belief in evolution, but you're ignoring a whole room full of evidence that shows it doesn't really work, that's not helpful to you or anyone else, and it's not science.
Are they grasping at straws in that instance?
Absolutely, I would say so. Yeah, they don't have much, so they pick on one little thing and then they make a big story out of it and say, "Oh, see."
Right.
Well, yeah. What about the 42 things over here that don't match?
Yeah, that preclude it.
That
preclude whale evolution.
And that's what we have to do. Let's talk about it all. Let's talk about the big picture. You have to think of it. You know, as an engineer, part of my job was to look at a factory. You can look at a factory like you mentioned. Yeah, here there's processes that are very similar, forming or bending metal and then welding metal. Those things are similar, but you got to look at the whole city of the factory of material coming in, going to the right place at the right time, quality products being put together, being delivered to an assembly line with the correct paint colors, with the correct part numbers, with everything and thousands of things coming together, and you've got a car that the final technician just flips the key and it works. When you look at the big picture, and that's what I was taught to do, and I did as an engineer, you look at the big picture of science. You can't just focus on a little bit and say, well, that proves evolution. No, it doesn't. It's just one little thing that you might be misinterpreting or not have all the facts because you're ignoring, especially since you're ignoring everything else. So when somebody tells you that this thing is changing into that, let's talk about the DNA that has to be behind it, the blueprints for those different products. They're going to be very different in the end stages, aren't they? And that's how it is with animals and people and so on. But people are more than animals. We're created in the image of God. We can be creative. I haven't seen a monkey write a symphony yet,
Right.
let alone an adding machine or a calculator.
Amen. If they don't have a genetic mechanism that can take these creatures like Pakicetus to a blue whale over time, then their historical reconstructions are just stories, imagination, as you've put it.
You poor creationists, you just don't have enough imagination.
Well, as always, fantastic job tonight, Helmut. I always look forward to your presentations. They're always comprehensive and up to date. I've noticed you've always got up to date arguments, information addressing the best that they have to offer. And so I do want to encourage people. I've got the links here in the side chat from my mod and also in the description box to check out Helmut Welke's bio, website, past presentations, including presentations here.
That's an old list, but it still works. The best thing at the end of my talk, you still have that info@creationtn.org. You can contact me directly. And I do like to travel. I have PowerPoint and will travel.
Awesome. I'll have to
present.
We'll have to get you over here to Canada one day, Helmut.
Hey, I agree.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. 2 hours has flown by. Again, I know how busy you are, Helmut, and I really appreciate the time that you've given for this. Any final words, final thoughts, anything you want to leave our audience with tonight?
Well, I would just reiterate what my final comment was, the big picture. Look at the big picture. Look at all the branches of science that have to fit the puzzle. And the more we look at it, if you've got a puzzle and you've got 99 out of let's say 200 pieces and they all point to creation, maybe that's the better explanation.
Amen. Well said. Great final words, Helmut. Again, to the audience, please, if you're just joining us, make sure as we wrap things up here, go back, watch from the beginning. Helmut gave a very thorough presentation addressing your famous transitional forms like Tiktaalik, Archaeopteryx, and the Whale series. And so, Helmut, I appreciate it again. Thank you for those final words, final thoughts. And to the audience, thank you so much for tuning in, both critics and non-critics. Also, thank you for the feedback, questions, and challenges. With that, Standing for Truth is out. God bless all.